Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Today, joining Diana is Mike Giresi, Director of Clinical Development at Family First Adolescent Services, located in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Mike found his passion for helping others through his own journey of healing and recovery and is a national speaker and educator. Mike joins Diana to discuss innovative therapeutic approaches for adolescents and what family engagement looks like in the process of change. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mike. I am now going to pass the conversation over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura. Wow, that's a big agenda for today. For 30 minutes, right? You think you and I can cover all that today?
Very quickly, yes.
All right. Good to see you, Mike, and welcome
to see you too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start with your personal journey. That will inform our discussion, I think. If you're
willing. Yeah. Where to start is the question, maybe. Well, maybe in terms of like how I got started in this whole mental health and recovery thing.
Love that.
First
Perfect.
place.
Yes.
It was actually literally, I tell people this, and it's funny now looking back on it, but the first time I even heard the term mental health was when my family put their foot down and sent me to treatment. And the concept of this, talking about emotions and my own mental wellness, none of that was even in my realm whatsoever. So in my own recovery journey of going to treatment, really kind of engaging in sobriety and recovery and in the recovery community. And I got introduced, but without boring you with the details, I got introduced to the 12-step community. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely just fell in love with it. And there were so many people that were just so good to me. And I had no idea why. I was so broken and desperate, and I felt like I wasn't worth their time in any way, shape, or form, and yet they kept spending time with me and being so good to me. And I came to find out, along the way that, a large part of what was driving them to do that with me was that because somebody did that with them. And this idea of giving back and not being able to keep what we don't share and freely give away, and these kinds of concepts that were so foundationally important to my journey in the beginning. I fell in love with helping other people in that 12-step process and community. And then I got my first job in the treatment field at a trauma and addiction treatment center, where I was introduced to trauma work. And then I fell in love with that. Mm-hmm. And again, just a term I hadn't even considered or been aware of or just anything like
childhood, that. Right?
Yeah, it was just one of my mentors, Larry Heller. He talks about these what he refers to as adaptive survival styles. Oh. And I love his line. He says, "A survival style isn't a survival style until you become aware of it. Before that, it's just called your life."
Right.
And I can very much relate to that.
Yeah.
So I dove into that stuff, and I really just I had a bunch of really amazing teachers and mentors, and that all really encouraged me to get as much learning and training as I possibly could. So I did all this. I, was doing everything I could possibly do. And, I went to India, I studied yoga and meditation. I did breathwork training and trauma training and somatic training and all of these different things. And it's interesting what kind of landed me in the spot that I'm in now, which is at Family First Adolescent Services, is kind of like this really cool culmination of a whole bunch of that work and a bunch of, seemingly serendipitous kinds of experiences, and all coming together to really kind of, really supporting me to reconnect with myself and with my family and my true passion, which is to help kids and parents and families to reconnect with themselves and each other.
It's a great mission, great passion. I can see that. That's a big bite to chew. So tell me what at Family First, I know that I would love to hear, how do you begin that process of helping young people heal and work with the families? What does that look like?
There's so many different aspects to it, right? Because it's just so complex. Like everyone coming in the door, these boys, they're so beautifully, uniquely complex in their own ways and coming from their own historical or cultural or familial backgrounds. The really kind of honoring how complex they really are and not reducing them down to these kind of oversimplified diagnostic labels is probably the first step, is really just being open and present and curious about what it is that they are wanting for themselves, and really kind of inquiring and creating a container and a process where they can feel more secure within themselves to explore the obstacles both internally and externally that are in the way of them moving closer to what it is that they want for themselves. The internal obstacles, more often than not from our perspective, come from these different attachment, relational, and developmental trauma patterns that have been laid down in their brain and their nervous system and carried forward into their kind of current day life, relating to themselves and the world through all these different filters of self-rejection and self-criticism and self-hatred and shame and guilt. The external obstacles largely are the dynamics in the family system that have remained stuck and closed, and have sometimes have a lot to do with the parents' own unresolved complex trauma patterns. It has to do with a lot of their own shame and guilt, has a lot to do with the pain and stress and suffering that they've experienced historically or culturally or environmentally that have really impacted their way of kind of connecting with and caring for their kids in the way that they really want to be able to. They just don't really feel as though they're equipped or have the resources to do so. Yeah. So the kind of looking at it from that orientation is probably, and attacking it from that place is probably the foundation of all of it. How we do that gets more complex.
Sure.
But yeah.
So do you have a favorite, not person, but a situation that you have been engaged in recent years where you thought to yourself in the beginning, this is so stuck, we can't help, and then have been witness to the, sort of that miracle of real change? Do you have a situation that you can describe in that way?
I have a bunch of them actually. But maybe let me check in with myself and just see which one might be the best example. This is a good example. So we had a family who the father was an inner city police officer for like 20, 30 years. And he came in we run a parent kind of intensive that is historically what we did was we did a day and a half with the parents and then a day and a half where we integrate the boys in with the parents. And on day one, this dad, he was in the group and I did this whole spiel about complex trauma and, explaining what it is so that we could understand how to move forward, generally speaking. And he raised his hand and he said, I don't mean to be rude. He said, but, this is just a bunch of crap, basically. And he said, I've had tons of things happen in my life. And he laundry listed this just unbelievably painful and awful laundry list of terrible things that were going on in his environment growing up and this things that had happened to him. And his thing was, and look at me, I'm still functional. I pay my bills. I go to work. I've had a steady job. I don't do drugs. I don't, all of that kind of stuff. And he said, so all of this is just really excuses and, it doesn't really, matter and all that kind of stuff. And I remember my response was something to the effect of, I used to get really triggered by people like this until I did my own work around this kind of dynamic. And and it was so wonderful. Even now, just reflecting back on it, it's really wonderful reflecting on it. I said something to the effect of, is it okay if I reflect what I was, experiencing or thinking as you're just finishing up? And he said, yeah. And I said, I actually agree with you almost entirely. I also agree with what I said entirely. And I know those two things seem to be in conflict with each other right now. But as we go through the weekend, maybe we'll this will shed some light. What we do will shed some light as to, what I mean by that. And he just kind of looked at me a little perplexed and kind of nodded his head. And by the end of the weekend, he was just to paint the picture a little bit more. He the shirt he was wearing was like two guns on his chest, and it was a little bit of a domineering figure. And his son described him as he never saw him shed a tear, not one twinge of vulnerability, and felt very emotionally and relationally disconnected from him. By the end of the weekend, he was in a puddle of tears of not grief or sadness, but of gratitude for just this heart opening that he experienced in being able to connect with his son and with the other members of the group as they navigated these different patterns that they took at one point to be who they were as human beings. That it's not that he had challenges trusting people and that was a pattern left over from an environment early in his life that was untrustworthy, but that people are just untrustworthy. And that's the way that it is. And so this is who I am in response to that. And as we started to slowly tease this apart and really bring some awareness to how he was relating to himself in the present moment, as he reflected back on having an environment that wasn't adequately supportive for him, this grief that started to show up was this kind of reconnection to the heart that he had been missing in relationship with his son. As he started to allow for a deeper connection to some of this grief around what he didn't have and always needed, there was this opportunity or space that was created in the relationship for his son to then walk into the group and experience his dad coming from a completely different place. And his dad was saying things that he had never said to him before. And he was experiencing him in a way that really was transformative on a foundational level for their relationship. not to the extent of like trying to fix these different problems so that he didn't have to feel the potential pain of grief or loss. Or the idea was that if I'm connected to my heart and with you, no matter what happens, we're going to be okay, because our relationship is what matters most. Never thought that was going to happen at the beginning of the weekend, but
that's where he got.
That's where he got, and that's where their journey kind of had this unbelievable opportunity to springboard forward from.
What a healing. What a healing. Yeah. I remember teaching those psychoed weekends or sessions are incredibly powerful, and I've done a number of those myself. But I had sort of the converse memory, and that was the really, really sweetheart guy, sweetheart dad, would do anything for his son and did. And a family constellation that was furious at the dad, but he was this sweetheart guy. And sort of through the process of looking at his fear, was he a sweetheart guy just because he was scared, or because he thought that's what he needed to do? And it turns out, like many sweethearts among us, including myself, that kindness and people pleasing doesn't come from strength. It comes from avoidance, and it comes from fear. So I love it that you're talking about this stuff like right up front with these families. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how, the way that we kind of hold it is that these strategies that people use, the people pleasing and the symptoms that look like codependency or even counterdependency, like I was talking about with my example, that those don't come out of nowhere. That you didn't just wake up one day and think, man, I think this is going to be a really effective way of going about my relationships.
And my life. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a basket case, right? People struggle, but that isn't what their goal is. And so for us to listen and be witness to the change in parents from they're doing this to me to it must be awful to live inside their head is, a beautiful transition. I've seen it too. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes we think about like we hold this question in mind when working with the parents and the boys, where we'll ask this question, sometimes explicitly, most of the time internally, as we're just listening to them and connecting with our own experience at the same time, is what's missing here? I can see that this person or this parent, let's say, is moving really easily towards tears. And they move really easily towards hopelessness and collapse and helplessness. And when they've described what they're describing, that they're feeling so depressed and hopeless about, I actually find myself feeling oftentimes like kind of angry for them. And yet,
yeah,
I don't necessarily hear any of that from them, which gives me so much information as to maybe what's missing here that might support them in actually moving towards what they want. But like you said, when you're deathly afraid of your own capacity for connecting to anger, that becomes a really, really important obstacle to explore. Because until that kind of dynamic is shifted, you could give somebody all the tools in the world for setting boundaries, speaking up for themselves, stating their needs, and they don't have the capacity to enact it.
Right, because anger is fuel. Anger is information. It is signals that
Yeah.
we need to set the boundary. If you don't allow yourself to experience that, you're right. You wouldn't use a boundary tool because you wouldn't know one was needed, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, you know, sometimes we'll refer to like this kind of basic emotion of anger or healthy aggression. Sometimes we'll even refer to it as like it's connected, if not synonymous, with our own life force. Without, you know, this capacity, we just couldn't do anything for ourselves. And so often this is stuck because people are pointing that anger back at themselves through self-criticism, self-hatred, self-rejection, guilt, and shame, all these patterns that have been left over from early childhood adaptations.
Mhm. So the anger doesn't go away until it's actually felt, right?
It's going to try, you know, another Larry, you know, kind of concept, Larry Heller that I mentioned earlier, is like that early childhood trauma largely is about supporting somebody later on in their life with it, at least, is about supporting, in large part, completion of incomplete emotional responses to unmet needs in childhood. And until there's a certain kind of completion in that process, the emotion's going to try to complete itself. It's going to come up to the surface organically, but we're going to continue shutting it down through shame and guilt and self-rejection, self-hatred.
Okay, repeat the first part of that because it triggered a thought and I want to go to it. Okay, say it again about.
Yeah, of course. Well, tell me if this is it. You know, in large part, supporting people later on in their life who have suffered early childhood trauma or adversity is in large part about supporting the completion of incomplete emotional responses to unmet needs in their early lives. And completion can be a little confusing because it's never over necessarily. But another way of potentially thinking about it is emotional connection to disconnected emotions related to early trauma.
Right. But there is, you know, the process of adulthood is taking all of these things and completing. That is the process of adulthood.
Right.
So it's not an unhealthy process for somebody who is struggling or sick. It is the process for
That's
all
right.
of us, right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah, the sometimes we'll even think about, like, I like to think about it like this. It's like not all emotions are created equal. There are some emotions that are almost like tethered to these early survival patterns that manifest as codependency and, you know, or acting out aggressively, or any kind of which side you look at it. It's almost like a default response.
Mm-hmm.
And typically the default response on an emotional level is a part of a way of covering up or shutting down the primary emotion that feels really scary to connect with.
So you're really feeling vulnerable and unsafe, but you connect with anger.
That would be the hoped for outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. Nice. So when you talk about the boys, how old are these boys? Yeah.
They're ages 13 to 18. 18, if they're still in high school, like, you know, they just turned 18, hanging around other high school kids and stuff like that. I like to say that, you know, if they have a better beard than me and they're 18, it might not be a good fit.
Right. If they're 13 and have a better beard, then okay.
Then I don't know, but that might be a whole nother thing. It's not hard to have a better beard than me. That's kind of the idea. But Yeah, we get boys from all over the country, all different kinds of backgrounds. They're here for a minimum of 45 days we like to have them here for around 90 days, and really kind of addressing a lot of these symptoms and behaviors that are showing up on the surface by bringing some light to or identifying these different patterns that are driving them.
Yeah, I like it. What a privilege and an honor to do that kind of work at any age, really. I know that some of these families are desperately miserable that they're in a position where their kids have to do this work in order to be okay. But the fact that they are doing this work is life-changing. And so it's miracles that you're witnessing. I know that.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And it really is unbelievable to watch the parents engage, because we're so incredibly connected with the parents. We hold them to a pretty high standard of participation with us. I mean, they're doing multiple groups per week. They're doing family sessions every week. They have their own individualized parent treatment plans that are about the consensual agreements they've made to do their part in all of this work. One of my favorite kind of quotes about the impact of all of that from the parent's perspective on the kid is from, if you're familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist mindfulness teacher. He said one time, the greatest gift that we could ever give to our children is our own happiness. And he says, because they'll take responsibility for it.
And they'll feel great. That's right. That's hilarious.
Now, my little add-on to the end of that is the equal and opposite is also true. They'll take responsibility for our anxiety, our depression, our workaholism, our alcoholism, our marital issues, our family conflict. They'll take responsibility for all of it because they have to. They don't have the choice about whether or not they're going to remain in this relationship or not. All they have available to them is the ability to adapt to what's available in their environment rather than what it is that they might actually need.
Right.
So the greatest thing a parent could literally ever do for their child is their own work on all of these different dynamics.
And in my perspective, own that they aren't going to meet every need. Own that the need wasn't wrong, that parents are all human too.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that actually parents challenges admitting that or owning, like feeling compassion towards themselves around just the limitations that they have. The barriers to that are just as problematic as almost anything, if not more so. Agreed.
Well, it's an acknowledgement of lack of power in some ways, right?
That's exactly right.
And it's scary as a parent to think, oh my God, they really aren't in my safe hands at a certain point.
Yeah, well, renegotiating a relationship like that from them being completely dependent on you to only semi-dependent in an effort to support them to become independent is a tricky spot. Yeah. Especially for people who, again, themselves as parents have their own unresolved issues around separation and individuation emotionally and psychologically themselves. So when they see their kids starting to separate and individuate on that level, it triggers all of these unresolved fears of what that means ultimately and where that's going to lead. Exactly.
Well, you have spent a half an hour, Mike, talking about something that you are very clearly passionate about. I love it that there are people like you out there who look at this in a very broad context beyond diagnosis, beyond individual fixing and see this as a way, what I heard, of becoming whole. So thank you. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much, Diana.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.